So tell me in a summary, what is neurofeedback?
So neurofeedback essentially, it used to be called brainwave biofeedback, which a lot of people understood that you can measure biometrics. So we measure heart rhythms, we can measure things like galvanic skin resistance, which is tension. We can measure pulse ox, we can measure heart rates, we can measure all different things. These are electrophysiological proxies of the body. So electrical activity or just changes in dynamic functions of how the brain's processing or how the body's processing. So neurofeedback kind of came to being from looking at brainwave activity and recognizing that the human brain can connect itself to a computer monitor through a brain-computer interface. And so what that does, it creates the ability for the brain to recognize that it can change and modulate its own activity. So neurofeedback has become, think of it as now more of the ability to change the brain's actual structure with hemodynamics and blood flow, but actually the way that the brain wires and recruits neurons to support different brain functions. So it's pretty neat to watch. It's pretty complex, but everyone can do it because you have the ability to change brainwave patterns simply by recognizing that you're the person that's controlling what's happening on the screen.
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
So I know you mentioned earlier you work with kids and adults. Is there any minimum age, maximum age?
So minimums typically around 4 years old. Maximums, we don't really have a maximum because we have data on lifespan all the way into later 80s and things like that. But as young as 4 years old is really kind of our starting point. And the reason is because the brain is developing so fast at that age. Under 3 years old, there's a lot of dynamic changes that are happening, and the data just kind of goes all over the place as far as where somebody should be. So 4 years old is typically the youngest that we'll see.
Okay. What kinds of situations or issues, disorders, what kinds of things does it treat and maybe not treat?
Yeah, no, great question. So the research and literature has really kind of surrounded and become very gravitated towards things like attention deficit disorder. A lot of the big studies that were done, there's actually a really nice study that has its 16 study meta-analysis of neurofeedback and how it works as a standalone really well, and they were using it to compare it against medication therapy and other therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, and it really had hit a home run in that aspect, because once the brain recognizes itself and it's given the feedback to produce calm, relaxed, focused patterns, then the neurofeedback progresses and gives the person a really good feedback system. So the easiest way to explain it is when we do neurofeedback now, before we used to do it where you'd sit in front of a computer screen and you'd play a video game with your brain and the little characters would move when your brain was focused and calm and relaxed. But that gets really boring after a while when you're playing Pac-Man and the Pac-Man only moves and doesn't change directions. But now we've gotten it down to where we can use something simple like Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, and you can watch a movie or a show, and when your brain is calm, focused, and relaxed, the screen brightens and you can watch the movie. When your brain gets distracted, drifts off, or gets tense or anxious, the screen gets dark. And over time, the brain learns how to control the brightness on the screen because it recognizes that if it's calm, focused, and relaxed, it gets rewarded for that. And so the brain seeks that out. In psychology, we call that operant conditioning, and that's exactly what it is. It's a quote-unquote punishment with a dark screen that the brain tries to avoid, and it's trying to seek out the reward by producing those correct patterns.
Wow.
Yeah, so to answer your question, ADD, ADHD, there's a lot of people that are utilizing it for things like anxiety, for depression. There's research and studies on fibromyalgia, chronic pain, epilepsy. There's a really great resource online with the ISNR, the International Society for Neuronal Regulation. I think they changed their name a couple times. But that's such a great resource because parents or adults or executives or even athletes can go on there and look at the different studies that neurofeedback has been beneficial for. So it's a great resource and tool. I think I shared that with you, and there was probably had a lot to sift through with that website.
Yeah.
It was a lot.
So there's so much. I mean, from the articles you sent me, there's so much evidence being studied now. So many different types of conditions. So it sounds like there's a lot of promise for so many different issues.
It's evolving, yeah. I mean, I think the core research, there was two people that kind of stood out in our field early on, and that was Dr. Joel Lubar at the University of Tennessee and Dr. Barry Stearman at UCLA Medical. They really laid down the foundational groundwork, even that was a little bit further on from people like Joe Kamaya. These are people that studied neurofeedback and brain mapping. Even at the beginning, we saw the promise of how it was affecting people in general. But this even goes further back into the 1960s and 70s during Gemini, Mercury, and Apollo, when there was a lot of studies being done on basically how astronauts or how test pilots were responding to overload and work performance. And these guys are smart, so they figured out if they stare at this little green light that's on a box, that they're able to, get moved on and advance through, different stages of that program. So the realities and the realization really came by way of almost accidental, but once it was discovered that the brain can modulate and change itself, the studies around it just kept growing and growing. So, this is 27 years that I've been doing this, and I've seen the field just evolve. The technology has had to evolve to keep up with the really fast human brain, but now seeing how everything's evolved, it's now coming into, I think it's hitting its stride. The research is being supported. A lot of major laboratories, universities are conducting research on neurofeedback. It's very popular in Europe as a first-line intervention for ADD. They don't seek out medication first. They seek out alternative things first and then resort to the medication if needed. But we're trying to get that mindset to get shifted over here.
So if someone is already in therapy, on medications, how does neurofeedback fit into what they're currently doing?
So what's great about neurofeedback is that it's very complementary to a lot of other therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, medication therapy, speech and language therapy, even working with speech pathologists. But from the medication perspective, we like to work with the prescribing doctors, because if you can imagine a human brain that is neurotypical or very functional and does well, and you medicate it, the medication is going to create potentially some side effects because now you're over medicating. So one of the things that we've seen is that whenever we start someone on neurofeedback after they've started neurofeedback or the brain mapping process, sometimes the side effects will start to kind of rear their heads a little bit, because when the brain starts to do the work on its own from the electrical side of things, the chemicals are also interacting with that. The brain is electrochemical. So if we can influence the electrical aspects of the brain and the signaling, the chemistry or the chemical side of things can be a little bit, it can not so much compete, but it's just layers that are added on that are extra now. So we like to work with providers, prescribing doctors, and discuss titration. And that's simply a way of just reducing the medication carefully over time to where we can manage and adjust those little side effects that start to show up.
How long is usually the process for neurofeedback?
So typically when we start with the brain map takes about an hour to do, and then we have to run the data through a network of databases. And then once we get that information back, a family will take a system home, and they can vary from 4 to 6 weeks, but our goal is really to get to anywhere between 20 to 40 sessions, and it can be done every day. It can be done twice a day, actually. The research says there's really no benefit to doing more than twice a day, and you got to space that out about 3 hours. So think of it as like a gym routine. If you go to the gym every day, you're going to get that beach body much quicker than if you go to the gym twice a week. So we try to encourage people to really get the use out of the home system that they take with them and utilize it in that environment where they're comfortable. They don't have to drive to the office. There's a lot of cost savings that go into that as well too, doing it at home.
So after those 20 to 40 sessions, is it usually the one-time thing, or do people sometimes need maintenance sessions later?
Rarely do people need extensive follow-up. Sometimes I've had some families that they'll come over the summertime and they'll do a series of sessions. They'll do 10, 15, 20 sessions, and then I'll see them again the following year, but that's very rare. Most of the time with neurofeedback, the brain is correcting a lot of these underlying imbalances, and once they're corrected, there's a period where the brain kind of moves into this reorganization phase, and then once it lands and settles into that stage where they're at, we'll typically do a follow-up brain map just to see where the person is, and then we'll discuss, cost benefit of doing more neurofeedback, mainly because once you've corrected the underlying imbalances, the brain isn't one of those things where you can just put a sensor in one spot and then get that balance and everything else, is going to, there's a lot of changes that happen whenever you do neurofeedback in one area, and because it's a network of information that's going in and out of those pathways into that part of the brain, we start to see a cascade effect happen. So a lot of times we'll get brain maps that show that they have excessive amount of slow wave activity in that frontal area of the brain, and the back of the brain, the anterior part of the brain, also has excessive amounts of slow wave activity. And then we'll only train the front of the brain, and because these pathways that originate sometimes in the back through the dorsal route, or these ventral routes that travel front to back, left to right, by just simply doing neurofeedback in a select few areas, those pathways become opened up. So I tell people it's kind of like trying to find the clog in the drain in the house. Sometimes the clog is near the sink, sometimes it's near the outside of the house. So the great part about what we do and how we do our neurofeedback is that we'll do a QEEG brain map first, and that brain map is kind of our roadmap and our GPS to say, these are the top 4 areas that have the highest deviation from norm. We're going to focus on those, and then we'll see improvement and changes happen up to 37-40% normalization from a pre and a post brain map just by training 2 to 4 areas, and we see a global change to the brain just from training those 4 areas.
Okay, I was going to ask, so I work with people of all different ages in psychiatry, and sometimes we know what the issue is, sometimes we don't always know what's going on. If someone with the latter issue, they weren't quite sure, they know they're struggling with certain things, would they still benefit from coming to do neurofeedback if they're not quite sure what the problem is?
Yeah, so neurofeedback and brain mapping, so I would say that we don't use the brain mapping as a diagnostic tool. We look at it as a differential diagnosis. Looks like, acts like, sounds like, behaves like ADD, anxiety, depression. What we're doing is we're looking at taking the onion and peeling it all the way back to its core and saying, these are the functional parts of the brain that are producing too much or not enough of a certain frequency, and it's creating a cascade effect that we know as a clustered group of symptomologies gets a diagnosis, right? But ultimately we're looking at, is the anterior part of the brain, that our executive control, decision making, emotional regulation, impulse control part of the brain, is it functioning correctly? And if it isn't functioning correctly, that can manifest itself very differently in every single individual. For some people, they may have trouble making good decisions. For other people, they may have trouble regulating emotions. But the core problem and issue is in that area, and that's what we focus on. So it really just depends on the person. And we don't know a lot of times how they're going to respond to neurofeedback, because the brain kind of orders itself in what it feels is the most important thing. So as we're making these changes, the brain goes through these dynamic changes, and we'll get reports back from people first couple weeks, and they'll say, hey, I'm sleeping better, or hey, I notice that I'm more aware of my negative thought patterns, and that adds a whole different cascade of different things that you have to address. Because I would say that I get the question of, are there any side effects to neurofeedback? And the answer is, I would say that you can call it a side effect, but a lot of people say, well, you do neurofeedback and you become very emotional. You become very aware of your negative self-talk. That can be really hard on the human psyche, because you don't realize how much negative self-talk you have. So a big part of what we do, and this is where my clinical psychology background comes into play, is that we'll typically try to encourage that person to seek out a professional within the mental health realm to help them develop new tools and different things that they can utilize to get through that part of that negative self-talk. Why is that negative self-talk there? Is this an irrational belief system that has developed from very early childhood experiences? And how's the brain protecting us currently, and how is it that now that we're aware of those things, how do we integrate that thought process into day-to-day life? So it's pretty complex.
So you have a psychology background. So how did you go from the psychology background? How did you evolve into being interested in this?
That's my favorite story to tell. So I was an undergraduate at the University of Central Florida, and I took a neuropsych class because I wanted my psych degree. I knew very early on that I wanted to help people with psychology. I go back to 7th grade, where my friends used to tell me that I was the one they came to for all their problems. So I was like, I think I should be a therapist. So I'm at UCF, and I do this neuropsych class. And the professor was a neuropsychologist that had a private practice outside of being a university professor. And we got to the section in the neuropsych course about imaging and different things that you can use to look at the brain. So we covered MRI, we covered CT, we covered EEG. And he had mentioned that if there was any students that were interested, he did like an internship where you could come and learn about QEEG, which is quantitative EEG. That's taking the brain waves, digitizing them, and turning them into numbers. Well, I was interested, so I went and walked into a room, and there was a graduate student that was putting a brain cap on somebody, and he flipped a switch, and there was 19 lines going across the screen, and I said, I want to know what every single one of those lines means and what they are. And 27 years later, I've been studying it and learning it. Went through graduate school to be a mental health counselor, and found out very quickly that the clients that I worked with that chose to try the neurofeedback along with talk therapy, their learning curve and their catharsis happened so much faster. Mm-hmm. So eventually I ended up switching to just doing full-time neurofeedback, and I left my talk practice, and now I let the brain do all the work.
That's great. I think a lot of people are glad that you did that.
Yeah.
So how long ago did you start your clinic?
So I started pretty early on. I would say that after I graduated from UCF, which was in 2001, my clinic first opened its doors, and as a psych student, you don't really know much about business, so you go through a lot of ups and downs. But the first clinic was probably opened back in 2001. And since then, I've had several different clinics that I've opened and closed, and just expanded into more and more things that really brought me back into more of the integrative functional route. And I started to work with really well-respected, functional medicine doctors, and that's when the real interest really came into understanding the human brain, because once you understand how the brain dynamically works from a brain mapping neurofeedback perspective, the questions are then, how is the rest of the body interacting with this brain that is just so full of metabolics and different dynamics? Mm-hmm. And so I took a big interest, and about 10-15 years ago now I started to learn a little bit more about the functional side of things. So looking at organic acid testing, neurotransmitter testing, DNA methylation pathway testing, that just really took my interest to the next level, which is now what everyone talks about, is that gut-brain connection. And so just even knowing what I know about neurofeedback and adding that as part of our practice is our latest evolution, which is now we're able to take a brain map, a neurotransmitter test, and get a fundamental baseline of where the brain's at chemically and electrically. And then that leads to all different conversations about the gut, food, dysbiosis, leaky gut, irritable bowel syndrome, and how these gut microbiomes, which live in our gut, make up 90% of our serotonin, which people think serotonin is here. It comes from the gut. So learning about that has also created a huge impact on our ability to help people with neurofeedback, because now we're looking at those different pathways, and if those aren't clear, we address those first, get everybody balanced in the gut, increase our probiotics, increase our nutrition, and then once people are healed or feeling better on the inside, then the clarity starts to work itself into better understanding, and the neurofeedback really becomes very efficient.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like the neurofeedback works best when you're doing certain other healthy things in combination with it.
100%. Yeah,
the
100%.
Lifestyle.
The lifestyle is a big one, because if you're eating a lot of inflammatory foods and you have these, they're called inflammatory cytokines, right? These cytokines, their job is to create inflammation. So lifestyle obviously is a really big proponent of what we try to teach a lot of the families we work with, because ingesting foods that are inflammatory, the first thing that you see a lot of times is that inflammation in the gut, and these are different immunoglobulins, right? So you have like anaphylaxis, you have inflammatory gut, these immunoglobulins that get elevated. Well, when that happens, neurotransmitter production stops. So if you're on a very inflammatory diet, or your foods are not helping out with your nutritional intake, then that causes all kinds of cascade effects with inflammation in the body, which can lead to other things as well too.
Mm-hmm. So is that something you mentioned that you can do some of the testing here in the clinic? Mm-hmm. And what would be the follow-up for working on some of those adjustments with a patient?
Yeah, so we simply just make really lifestyle changes is a big one, right? So get plenty of water is a big one, right? The motility process of really getting people out and moving around is a big process as well too. And these are just overall changes that people really need from a stress perspective, to get out and go for a walk every so often. If you're working at a desk all day long, that's a simple recommendation, right? You don't have to be a doctor to know that. You need to really get up and move around. But when it comes to the lifestyle changes, which is recommendations for supplementation, we'll go through these labs. The labs are typically turned around in about a 2 to 3 week period. And then we take those labs and we look at, so for example, if we do an organic acid test and you have some systemic candida, which is very underdiagnosed in people, a lot of people don't really realize they walk around with candida or yeast until they have a yeast infection or something. Skin issues start to develop because of excessive amounts of fungus or yeast. If we can detect that early on and help the body to eliminate that using, things like natural herbs or things that are involved in lowering the amount of yeast and candida, then we're winning the war against, really trying to get the brain balanced, because two major components that happen when you have candida or yeast is you block two key nutrients. One is phenylalanine, the other one is tyrosine. Well, if you trace those back to their origins and then go forward a little bit, they're very key ingredients for developing or making neurotransmitters, specifically things like dopamine or epinephrine. So if you have these fungus or this yeast or even different types of bacteria that are present, then you're really stopping the process from forming the right nutritional basis to have good neurotransmitter production. So those things are important. We prefer using supplementation, nutraceuticals, homeopathics, and usually we recommend people, we give them the list of the things that we would recommend, and then they go back to their functional doctor or their nutritionist and they go, how can I integrate these things into a change as well that's going to be long lasting?
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it's changed so much from, some of the beginnings, your first clinics. Where do you see neurofeedback, or where do you see your clinic evolving like 20 years from now?
20 years, I would say that it's going to be more mainstream than we're seeing right now, where everyone is going to have a neurofeedback unit at home. I will tell you that some of the families we've worked with, one of the major things that we're lucky to tell them is that if you have a high response rate to neurofeedback and your brain gets it, your brain does really well with neurofeedback, this is going to be the thing that you'll use whenever you go through a depression or you go through anxiety or you're dealing with stress. Hook yourself up, to this neurofeedback machine and just let your brain reorganize itself into those patterns that are calm and relaxed and focused. So I think at the end of the day, this should be something that should be in every home. We reach into a medicine cabinet whenever we're sick. Why not reach into our next to our computer in our office and just grab our neurofeedback headset and put that on just to calm that nervous system down, and know that we're making changes, because if we do the biofeedback, lesson that we learned, is that the body, the brain can change if we're given the right feedback about ourselves. And all that is just tapping into our own biometrics and our own biorhythms to make those changes that we know are beneficial for long-lasting health and an increased, reducing that fight or flight system as often as we can.
Yeah, and increasing that awareness for even knowing when you're in a certain state. That seems to be the most helpful thing. Yeah,
I would think that's the number one thing that I tell people that neurofeedback is really good at, is creating awareness. And if you're aware, then you can make a change. And I think that lends back to a story where I had a parent whose son was really having struggles with school and getting homework done. Went through neurofeedback. He could get his homework done in under a couple hours after we were done. The mom would tell us that the neurofeedback didn't work. And I asked her, well, why do you think it didn't work? And she said, well, he comes home from school and then he's just lazy and doesn't want to do his homework. But when he chooses to do it, he can get it done in 2 hours. And my response was, well, neurofeedback is not mind control, right? It can't make you go do your homework, but if you decide to do your homework or you choose not to, you can become aware of the consequences that are going to come for not doing the homework. So it gives you the ability to be more aware of your choices, be aware of consequences, and then you can interact and make changes, because those changes are really what lead us to success, or they lead us down the path of really kind of struggling through life.
Right. So if someone was interested in coming to your clinic, what would be the first steps that they would take?
So first steps is they can go to our website, which is www.helix2, that's HEALIX, the number 2.com. In our contact page, it has basically you can fill out your information, and then we'll reach out and connect with you. You can also email us at hello@helix2.com, or you can call us at 407-708-3200.
All right. Thank you for sharing all that information. As a psychiatrist, I know medications can be very helpful, but also come carrying with a lot of side effects to it, and some don't always work. So I'm always in search of trying to find other ways to help people, especially safe, healthy ways that will give lasting benefits. So I thank you for sharing all that information. It's definitely
thank you for the time. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.